This screencast is about question number 2 of the Terms of Trade handout for Unit 1. First, this question is fantastic because we have something different than we're used to seeing. We have a production possibilities curve rather than a table of data. So what I like to do with stuff like this is I'm much more of a table or a list person. So I like to take the parties that are involved, in this case, the countries of Rayland and Artland. I'm going to put the hats up here. I'm going to put the bikes up here. And I'm going to take the data from the PPCs and I'm going to put them into a chart like we're used to. When you do this, make sure you always put the people or the countries on the left and you put the items that they're trading or producing on the top. So both of these countries are making the same amount of bicycles in a day. It's the hats that is different. So I'm just going to be careful and write down the appropriate numbers, 1,200 for Rayland and 600 for Artland. Okay, so now I want to level the playing field. And when I look at these numbers, I notice that both countries already make 300 bikes. So I don't really have to do much heavy lifting here. The playing field is pretty level already. But I find that working with numbers like 1,200 and 600 and 300, it's just a little bit more unruly. So I am going to reduce these a little bit. So I'm going to put both 300s in terms of 1, and therefore this is going to be 2 to 1, and this is going to be 4 to 1. So now that I look at this data, I notice that for every 1 bicycle Rayland makes, we would lose 4 hats. For every 1 bicycle that Artland makes, we would lose 2 hats. So we definitely want to make sure that Rayland is not making bikes because the opportunity cost is greater if we take them off of hats, right? We're going to lose more hats in our total production. So remember that little cross multiply trick? So 4 times 1 equals 4. 1 times 2 equals 2. Because this is an output question, I want to focus on the diagonal path that's 4 to 1 ends with the larger number. So that means that our comparative advantage that we just figured out using the ratios was correct, that Rayland has a comparative advantage in hats. Artland, therefore, has a comparative advantage in bikes. Neither country has an absolute advantage in bikes. But when I look at Rayland and Artland, I notice that Rayland just makes more more hats at the end of the day. So they have an absolute advantage in hats. So break down the data. Now let's delve into the question. It says that calculate the opportunity cost of a bicycle in Artland. So if we make 1 bike, then we lose 2 hats. And because I simplified the numbers, it's really easy to answer that. If you hadn't simplified the numbers, then all you would do, I'm not going to write on the table up there, I'll write it down here, is that you want to make the 300 in terms of 1 because you want to figure out how many does 1 bike make, right? So you're going to divide both sides by 300 and this equals 1 bike and this is going to equal 2 hats. So that's another way that you could get to that answer. If the 2 countries specialize in trade, which country will import the bicycles? Well, whichever country is not specializing in them has to import them. So that means that the answer is going to be Rayland, and your explanation could be a full sentence explaining that because Rayland has a comparative advantage in hats, they're going to need to import bicycles because they're not producing them domestically. Right now, their comparative advantage trade is 4 to 1. But let's say somebody came down, I like to say the fairy godmother, comes down and says, okay, let's do a 5 to 1 trade. Right now, they're doing 4 to 1. So you got Rayland making 4 hats, and you've got Artland making 1 bicycle. And now someone's saying, well, what if you did 5 to 1? Who would be interested in that? Well, Artland looks at that and says, okay, continue to make 1 bike, but now I'm going to get 5 hats. So for Artland, this is advantageous. And I want to use the word of the question in my answer. This is advantageous because they get to put in the same amount of effort, 1 bicycle, and receive more in return, 5 hats instead of 4. For Rayland, this is not advantageous because Rayland looks at this trade and says, well, prior to you, fairy godmother, I could make 4 hats and get 1 bicycle. Now I have to work harder and get the same return. I have to make 5 hats and get 1 bicycle. No good for Rayland. Now they're saying, what if productivity in Artland triples? So instead of making 600 hats, 6 times 3, that's 1,800 hats. Who has a comparative advantage in hats now? Well, if you look at this, we'll notice that the ratios end up staying the same, and Rayland is still going to have a comparative advantage in hats. The comparative advantage will not change. So that's Artland.